John Paul Jones stood on the deck of a slow, rotting, converted merchant ship and watched a brand new British warship turn its guns toward him. Over the next 4 hours, in sight of the English coast, he would hand the most powerful navy on earth one of the most humiliating nights in its long history. Jones should not have won. By every measure a naval officer would use, he was beaten before the first shot, but he had decided something the Royal Navy could not account for. He would rather sink than surrender. To understand the size of what he did, remember what the Royal Navy was in 1779. It was not merely strong, it was the ocean's landlord. For generations, British warships had done as they pleased on every sea in the world, and the idea that a ragtag American squadron might sail into British home waters and win a battle there was close to unthinkable. John Paul Jones thought it anyway. He was a Scot by birth, short, proud, and fiercely ambitious, a man who had crossed to the American side and made himself into the young republic's most aggressive naval officer. The Americans had almost no navy to speak of. What they had was a handful of ships, often borrowed, often French, and one captain who refused to fight small. In 1779, the French gave Jones an old East India Company vessel, worn out and past her best years. He converted her into a warship, armed her with a mismatched collection of guns of different sizes and reliability, and renamed her the Bonhomme Richard in honor of Benjamin Franklin and his Poor Richard's Almanac. Then he did the thing no one expected. He sailed his little squadron clockwise around the British Isles right up the coast, taking prizes and spreading alarm through towns that had not feared an enemy sail in living memory. On the evening of the 23rd of September, off a headland called Flamborough Head on the Yorkshire coast, he found what he was looking for. A large convoy of British merchant ships, dozens of them, loaded with timber and naval stores bound for the Royal Navy's own shipyards. Guarding them was a brand new British frigate, copper-bottomed and heavily gunned, called the Serapis, commanded by a hardened veteran named Richard Pearson. Pearson was no reckless glory hunter. He was a veteran of some 30 years at sea, a steady professional who had already survived hurricanes and fleet actions and had once held his post through internal bleeding until a battle was won. He did not need to beat Jones for pride. He needed only to do his duty and guard the convoy, and every advantage of ship and gun sat squarely on his side. This was the mismatch. The Serapis was newer, faster, and better armed than the Bonhomme Richard. Worse, early in the fight, 2 of Jones's old cannon exploded on their first firing, killing his own gunners and wrecking part of his main battery. His ship was outclassed and now half crippled. Pearson had every reason to expect a quick and total victory. Therefore, Jones changed the game. He knew he could not win a gunnery duel at range, so he refused to fight one. Instead, he drove his ship straight into the Serapis and lashed the 2 vessels together with his own hands and grappling lines until they were locked side by side, so close the gun crews could almost touch. Now the British advantage in speed and maneuver was worthless. Now it was not a naval battle. It was a knife fight between 2 ships tied to each other, and it would be decided by whoever simply refused to quit. For hours, the 2 ships tore each other apart at point-blank range. The Bonhomme Richard was being shot to pieces. She was taking on water, on fire in places, her hull opening up under the Serapis guns. At the worst moment, with his ship visibly sinking beneath him, Pearson called across and asked whether Jones had struck his colors, whether he was ready to surrender. Jones gave the answer that made him immortal. By the account most often repeated, he shouted back that he had not yet begun to fight. If you like a commander who is losing on paper and refuses to read the paper, subscribe. This is exactly the kind of story Redoubt was built for. It was not just defiance, it was true. Jones still had one advantage left, and it was up high. His men had climbed into the rigging with muskets and grenades, and from that height, they raked the open deck of the Serapis, killing the men who tried to work her guns. Then a sailor dropped a grenade through a hatch into the British ship, and it touched off a chain of powder charges below deck. The explosion tore through the Serapis, gutting her from the inside. Now it was the British ship that was dying. Pearson had watched his brand new frigate turned into a slaughterhouse, and his own deck was swept clean by the fire from above. At last, with his ship wrecked and his men falling, it was the British captain, not the American, who surrendered. The irony was almost too perfect. The Bonhomme Richard had won, but she was finished. She was too far gone to save, burning and flooding, and a day or so later, Jones watched his battered old ship roll over and sink beneath the North Sea. So he simply stepped across onto the captured Serapis, ran up his flag on his defeated enemy's deck, and sailed away. Think about what that meant. An American captain in a worn-out, borrowed ship had fought a superior British warship within sight of England, lost his own vessel, and still taken the enemy's. He sailed to a neutral European port, flying the American colors over a Royal Navy frigate he had beaten in Britain's own waters. To the young United States, desperate for any proof that it could stand against the world's great power, it was electric. The British saw it differently, and their reaction says everything. In the cheap printed stories that circulated afterward, they turned Jones into a monster, a marauding pirate to be feared like a villain from legend. That is what an empire does when a smaller enemy embarrasses it at home. It cannot admit it was outfought, therefore it calls the man who did it a criminal. The truth was harder for London to swallow. Jones had not slipped in and run away. He had stood and fought a superior Royal Navy warship to the finish in home waters, in front of a coastline full of witnesses, and he had won. For a country that treated command of the sea as a birthright, the sight of an American flag flying over a captured British frigate was not just a defeat, it was a crack in the idea that the Royal Navy could not be beaten. The biographer Evan Thomas, in his Life of Jones, argues that the man was difficult, vain, and impossible to love, but that he had the one thing the moment required: an absolute refusal to be beaten. The historian Samuel Eliot Morison, himself an admiral, judged the fight off Flamborough Head one of the most stubborn and remarkable single-ship actions in the whole age of sail. John Paul Jones would end his life a few years later, sick and half forgotten in Paris, far from the country he had fought for. But on one dark night off the English coast, a Scottish American in a sinking ship looked the Royal Navy in the eye, told it he had not yet begun to fight, and made it true. If you want more underdogs who humiliated far greater powers, subscribe to Redoubt. New story every few days. The next one is already waiting.